I'm chatting in from Brighton on this wonderful pre-snowstorm evening. And in the interest of time, I think we could probably get started. So my name is Wendy Pascual. I'm a housing fellow, and on behalf of both the Boston Society for Architecture and the City of Boston's Housing Innovation Lab, I want to say how excited we are to host the third of our Future Decker Conversation series. We're sort of exploring and having these conversations really to highlight the role that the triple decker has played in our cities and in this region. And this has really been a wonderful sort of like endeavor because we've heard from a variety of folks about their own experiences. And while I myself have not lived in a triple decker, I have come into contact with so many folks that have and have spent a lot of time in triple deckers and really grown to love this building form. For today's conversation, we're also hoping to look at the triple decker and try to imagine the future decker, right? Any sort of alternative rendition of this through an economic lens. And what has it looked like for folks to afford, to build, to own, to rent homes in triple deckers as well. And having and listening from folks that are currently doing this work, folks that have done extensive research on this building type as well, because it is a form of multifamily housing that is near and dear to so many of our hearts. One that has also shined a light on the complex histories that are associated with this building type. And maybe we can also get to have a conversation as to where it is that we want to go when it comes to building at this scale as well. And so for a little bit of context as to who are the entities that are sort of hosting this event, right? The BSA on one end, and we work with members and folks within the building, the built environment world, right? Different stakeholders as well, and making sure that there is a space that folks can come together to have conversations around this, to engage in this work, and find the resources that are available to them in the city. And then also the City of Boston's Housing Innovation Lab, this part of that came out of the Mayor's Housing a Changing City plan a few years ago, and really tasked with thinking about how we can creatively come up with alternatives to creating more affordable housing opportunities for folks in the City of Boston. And so I talked a little bit as to what the Future Decker is, but for some additional context, we do have a virtual exhibition that is up that showcases a lot of the work that we ourselves have done throughout the year, but also the work of our partners and folks that we've learned with and from, really around the sort of magic around triple deckers, but also the challenges, right, that come along with it. And so the exhibition will be up for many months, also forever, because it's the internet. But it is a way that a lot of you can also engage. There's some interactive components because we really do want this to be a collaborative experience. And we invite you to share your own stories about triple deckers, whether it is here in this conversation today, or whether it's on this virtual exhibition platform. And so, for today's agenda and what we'll be hearing about, learning about, and having a conversation about, right? We have a few guest speakers here who have introduced themselves just now, really providing a perspective on the history of affordability around triple deckers, where that's moved from when they were first introduced to this region over 100 years ago, but also where they are today. And then we will be switching to having a more regional perspective. So not necessarily City of Boston, but from our neighbors in Somerville. How have we been thinking about housing affordability when it comes to buildings at this scale, maybe not even necessarily triple deckers, and then coming back to Boston, right, and getting a sense as to what exactly are the programs that currently exist that allow for folks to stay in their homes, but to also be able to maintain their home environments in a way that is habitable, that is safe to live. And so with that, actually, I'll go back, right? towards the end of this, and this is something that we have asked folks to do, right, to really have a conversation with us in these spaces. I think that what is really interesting about tonight's event is that we have a smaller crowd, and so I'm hoping that, you know, by having this more like intimate conversation, right, that we can really engage and learn and listen to one another, whether it's your stories about triple deckers and how you've encountered the questions of affordability then, or you just want to also, whether it's to reminisce or to really call out the sort of different challenges that have come along with living in triple deckers, to feel free to come off mute and to also share those with us, and ask questions to our guest speakers, however they may come to you. And so with that, I will actually pass the mic to Sally Zimmerman, and we can hear a little bit about the history and the transitions to today's triple deckers. Sally, I will also give the remote control to you now, and you should be able to navigate this.
Looks like I can. So I'll go to this slide, which is where I'm going to start today. And it kind of encapsulates a little of the things that I've been thinking about and doing with three deckers, triple deckers over a long period of time. The views that you see, I'm now working with the community preservation program in Boston. So it's great to have a place in a program that is looking at preservation and affordable housing, as well as open space conservation, and to be able to bring some of the experience I have to bear on that grant program. So you're looking at a view on the left of an elevation drawing of 140 Spring Street in West Roxbury. That's a 1907 drawing of triple decker designed by a German-American, second-generation German-American architect, Jacob Leupold, who was responsible for hundreds of buildings in Roxbury, West Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, and a lot of whose architectural drawings are conserved at Historic New England's archive. So this is one of those. And this was a house for Mrs. H. Peters. And you can see what it was when it was built, and then what it looks like now. It's still standing. It's now on the ground floor, the Parkway Preschool, and the upper stories are still rental apartments. And you can see that a number of things have changed on the building. Mostly it's been sided, and that has done something to the character. Of course, you're looking at an elevation drawing that flattens out the base on the side of the building, so it hasn't had any demolition or anything like that. But in 2017, the poster on the right comes from a conference that Historic New England organized around this same topic. The affordability and preservation challenges that are facing the three-decker, which is pretty well known as an icon of New England architecture, and something distinctive and unique about our region that preservationists feel is important to conserve. We brought together planners, housing advocates, historians for a day-long conference that took place at All Saints Church in Ashmont, and we looked at whether three-deckers were still affordable, could be affordable. Did they still serve a place in the housing, in meeting the housing needs of our region? And the answer was yes, and perhaps the answer was maybe. In terms of affordability, yes, they are serving a housing niche quite well, but are they still affordable? And I think that what we came away from was, on that day, was the sense that with a good deal of support and a very strong intentionality about focusing on that kind of issue, that there were still opportunities to work with affordable options in multifamily housing of all sorts, but particularly because we all love three-deckers in three-deckers. So they are, of course, still affordable. in depressed real estate markets, you can go to Lynn and buy a 3-decker, I think. I haven't looked at a real estate page, but of course in Boston, that's a much more substantial challenge. As an architectural historian and a preservation planner, I have a good understanding of how we got 3-deckers in our neighborhoods and why they developed very strongly for the need for additional housing close in and with transportation to work locations, which is still what they're good for today. And basically in the late 19th and early 20th century. And why are there no more being built? Well, that is the story that my next slide tells. It does exist now, but it really is an artifact of the lack of zoning, the time before zoning regularized the way that development could happen. So I think many of you will probably know this image, and I have to acknowledge that I actually know very little about the missing middle housing, and I don't know very much about urban planning in its current practices, although I've done regulatory work in Cambridge in their neighborhood conservation district. So I'm pretty familiar with how overlays work, and I'm pleased to see that Cambridge and Somerville and even now Boston is considering some overlays for affordability. I have to credit Jake Wegman, who was one of the speakers at our conference and is now a planning professor at the University of Texas, whose work I first came across because his MIT master's thesis is on the demise of the 3-decker. I kind of disagree with his ideas about who this 3-decker was built for and how it got there, but I don't at all disagree with what he found for its demise, and it's pretty directly killed by the planning profession. Jake used this slide at our symposium to show, what's not here. We have big multi-story buildings. We have lots of actually very large now single-family houses on very large lots, but there's a lot in the middle that we're not getting. And I think if you look at that, it's really a historic. There are forms of housing that historically were quite common. Apartment courtyards, small apartment buildings. I live in a small 3-story apartment building in JP. It's a beautiful building. Little, small fourplexes, duplexes. And a lot of that we are not seeing any longer, and that's this missing middle. So, and how that happened, you can see the 3-decker, which they call a triplex stacked, because there are triplexes, triplexes in other communities, but I think we're kind of best known for the ones with the flat roof and the big porches. So single and 2-family zoning is really an artifact of early 20th century, the growth of the professional planning profession in the early 20th century. And there's no question that it's motivated by a desire to exclude or monitor or control the mixing of class and race and to push development in particular directions. I think we all know that zoning is a pretty inflexible tool for that. So, and one of the things Jake says in his article in the Journal of American Planning Association, single-family zoning persists as perhaps the most potent link in a chain of exclusion. What's our challenge now? Can we address affordability and still conserve an iconic building form? I see that when I went back and I looked at some of the things that I've said or been quoted saying about 3-deckers, that I guess sometime I said the condo is the savior of the 3-decker, which is true to some extent. But what do we do with that? I mean, if a 3-decker is turned into condos and they're worth millions of dollars, of course they're going to be well preserved. They're going to be well maintained. They're going to look beautiful. Do we, go back and say, oh, the only affordable ones are the ones that are denatured? I kind of think there should be a way to put the two of those things together. And I think there are ways that preservationists can find, can work with affordable housing advocates to figure out what do we need and what's the iconic piece of a 3-decker. Maybe it's the porch. And one of the things I want to talk about at the end of the session and hear what Desmond has to say is whether there would be ways, for instance, with some of the community preservation money, which I know Somerville is using, to really look at the icon and its use and preserve and conserve both of those things. So maybe we'll go for there in the next discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sally, and for getting us started on what I think will be a really promising conversation as well. And with that, I will pass it to Sam to hear about what y'all have been up to in Somerville.
Great, thank you, Wendy, appreciate it. And thank you, Sally, for kicking this off. And I think this is a good segue from your last bullet point there on a challenge of how do we preserve this as a building type and how to make it affordable and accessible. And that's something that we've been trying to do as an organization. So, as I mentioned before, my name's Sam LaTronica, and I'm the new real estate director at Somerville Community Corporation. Do I have access to this? I can change this slide, Lonnie.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Okay, just great. Yeah, I don't need to yet, but I've been with SEC for a little over 5 months now, and before that, I was at Fenway CDC in Boston, where I worked on larger multifamily preservation projects. So it was still doing affordable housing, but I went from a neighborhood with no triple deckers in it to a community where triple deckers are the dominant housing typology and a specific goal of the organization in terms of maintaining naturally occurring affordable housing. So at SEC, we actually have 2 distinct portfolios. One is this one that you're looking at right now, the traditional multifamily portfolio. This is what you typically think of as new affordable housing, low-income housing tax credit projects, much larger scale, 30 to 40 units each building. So that's sort of what I've been used to working with before, and we still do that work in Somerville as well. We have 10 buildings in this portfolio and about 215 or so units across those 10 buildings. And they're professionally managed by a third-party property manager. So in this picture, you can see these 3 buildings with the solar panels on them. These are all our affordable units in this one larger development. There we go. So we now also have this second portfolio, which we call our 100 Homes portfolio. And this is a new initiative that sprung up a number of years ago and is a partnership with the city of Somerville, and also another for-profit developer in the community has contributed to it through the inclusionary zoning ordinance. But basically, in contrast to our traditional portfolio, this one is much smaller in terms of each individual property. It's usually this 3 to 4 unit scale. You can see these are 3 of our specific properties on the left. We have an actual triple decker, but then we also have a number of these units that aren't, from a design perspective, a strict triple decker, but usually have 3 to 4 units in them. And, you can see what those look like, and they all fit into the the existing urban fabric of Somerville. So these ones we are they're much more spread out. We have about 20 buildings thus far across Somerville, 117 units total. We do self-manage these as opposed to hiring a third-party property manager. So that's a challenge that I'll get into in a bit, but that sort of comes with the territory of acquiring and financing these buildings all over the city. So first, I'll talk a little bit about our process for acquiring these. In order to compete with the market on these, because we're buying these off the open market from market sellers. So in order to compete with the market, we need to be able to move as quickly as a traditional market buyer can move. Someone who has greater access to capital and greater speed with which they can deploy that capital to acquire a home. So we have been able to set up a line of credit with MHIC, the Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation, and that has allowed us to move really quickly to acquire these properties. as with a sort of temporary financing solution in the interim. We still need subsidies in order to make these affordable, and those take time to get from the city, and those permanent financing packages take time to put together. So in the interim, we can use this line of credit we have with MPIC to go in and use that line of credit to cover 100% of the cost of acquisition plus some soft costs for closing, and then wait a few months while we put together this other package of subsidies and permanent debt that we can use to buy it. And then once we've done that at that point, then it's officially deed restricted affordable. It's in our portfolio, and now we manage it from that property management and asset management perspective. And we have plenty of other partners in that. We use local banks, East Boston Savings Bank, Winter Hill Bank. The city of Somerville has been incredibly generous with as I mentioned, the CPA funds that we get. So we're really, really appreciative that, all these different community partners have stepped up to help us do this work. So this presents both opportunities and challenges. In terms of the opportunities, this is the dominant, housing type in Somerville. And so there are a lot of opportunities for us to go in and acquire some affordable housing quickly. It's already, well integrated into the community. It preserves the physical feel, preserves the sort of diverse, vibrant, community that we, in Somerville, many of us, pride ourselves on. There are a lot of landlords in Somerville who, have owned for many years, who bought their homes when the market was in a much different place, and, bought their homes for their triple decker for probably less than $100,000 in many cases, and who were never really looking to make, a quick buck or charge an arm and a leg or anything. So there are a lot of these units that still have pretty low rents relative to the market. So this is an opportunity for us to go in and preserve that existing affordability that sometimes exists naturally. We have a lot of landlords who are, very invested in affordable housing. They're very community minded and, reach out to us proactively to ask about selling their property. They want to do right by the community. They want to give back. They understand that, their investment has increased significantly, and that they're very lucky, and they sort of want to, do what they can to keep that in the community, in the community spirit. So we are very lucky to have that. However, the challenges, the two biggest challenges that I've noticed in my time here in the last 5 months have been, the property management challenge, because this is, it's not often that community development corporations manage their own portfolio. Usually, like I said, with our other portfolio, we hire a third-party property manager to manage it. So that's been, there's been a learning curve there for us as an organization to manage this portfolio on our own. I don't come from a property management background. I've worked very closely with property managers, and we have one, full-time property manager who's by training a property manager. But it's certainly a new experience for us as an organization to dig into the compliance and certification and the financials and the repairs, maintenance, and we had to reach out to our maintenance tech to make sure that we're going to be plowing all of our residences tomorrow, and that's not often the core competency of a community development corporation. So that had a challenge. And it's also because the nature of this portfolio is so scattered site, it's all over the city. It's pretty hard to attract a larger third-party property manager to manage this type of portfolio. Every property is different. It's not 20 identical units that all have the same appliances, all the same faucets and sinks and everything that can be swapped in and out. New parts can be ordered in bulk. Everything's different. All the appliances are different. Everything's all over the city. So there are some inefficiencies there from a traditional property management perspective that do make it more challenging. And lastly, I think one of the biggest challenges to the question of maintaining affordability is, I think it can be done, but it can't right now. We haven't found a way to do it naturally yet. We haven't, found a way to do it without subsidy. We're still putting a lot of subsidy into these that we're getting from the city. And like I said, they've been very generous, and we're very appreciative of their support. But, I think there's sometimes a disconnect. And I mentioned that we have these landlords who are really, they're community minded. They haven't charged that much historically. They bought their homes a long time ago. Maybe they own them free and clear at this point. But, when they go to sell, I think if they're hiring a broker, if they're just looking around and seeing what the market is bearing, you know, the sales prices that these homes are going for don't actually reflect the current rents that are being charged. They reflect a much higher potential rent that could be charged, because you know, people know that there are those out there who can't afford to pay much higher rent for this. They know that there are you know, developers out there who are willing to buy these, you know, renovate the kitchens and baths and charge more rent. And so the price really reflects often the notion that there's someone out there who's willing to pay a lot more, even for the unit as is, than what's currently being offered. And so I think a lot of people don't often understand the mechanics of, you know, if you buy a home for X amount, you have to charge Y per month to make your rent payments, or to make your debt service payments. So often, you know, we find that these prices are going for a lot higher than the rents are currently being charged, and they're even sometimes less than what the affordable rents are. We follow, we have different income bands that we use based on the subsidies that we get, and so we have units available at 50% AMI, 80% AMI, and 100% AMI. And so in some of these cases, if we're charging 80% or 100% AMI, those rents are higher than what the unit was already, what the unit was currently generating. And we've paid a significant amount of money for the property and have used subsidy. And so at that point, it is deed restricted affordable. So it's taken off the market. You know, the price won't go up again if it's flipped, or if it's, you know, if it's removed from the speculative market. So it is good. And we can't, you know, we don't raise the rent significantly after that. They are deed restricted affordable. So we do preserve it, but it is really tough to find that way to preserve the really naturally occurring affordability. So that's been a major challenge, and something that we're still trying to get through. But, you know, as we acquire these and take them off the market, we do find that we're able to preserve them as affordable. They're deed restricted, and they will be in perpetuity. So something that we're really proud of. That's sort of the main points of our program, and, you know, I'm happy to talk about it and answer any questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Sam, for giving that overview and sharing truly a lot about the complexities that a CDC would have to sort of hold on to in order to make this possible for folks. And you did touch a little bit around property management, and I think that we can now hear from Desmond as to how owners today are tapping into ways that they can preserve their home environments. And what I will do is I will also stop sharing the screen. And that way we can, I'll just go back here and hear from you, Desmond.
Terrific. So I come from this from a little different perspective, right? So I work with individual homeowners. I'm a construction specialist and for the Department of Neighborhood Development. So what does that mean? That means that by the time a homeowner comes to D&D, the home is already in distress, right? And so we're actually, you know, I think both Sally and Sam talk about a bigger picture than we see. We see the individual homeowners, right? They come to us because for years, they've been in the neighborhood, and mostly families have lived in this house. They haven't been collecting the kind of rental income that would maintain the house, right? And so they come to us looking for some kind of relief. There are only certain things that we can do for them, right? And that's usually trying to keep the envelope of the house intact. Meaning we can only, you know, repair a roof that's leaking. We can only repair or replace a porch that's falling apart. And that's often not enough to maintain that house. So over a period of time, we have seen that these homes are leaving, or these owners have to leave the neighborhood. And what happens, and I think Sam alluded to this, is that either a developer comes in and buy this property and then raise the rent, or even another individual comes in and they're strapped by these loans and they have to raise the rent, and so we lose a part of the community. We are trying to attack this problem on a wider scale, But the problem is so huge that all we can do at this point is work with individual homeowners and try to do the best that we can to hold on to this thing. I am not sure that we're going to be able to go back to the way things were, just because of the cost of doing this. When I first started this job, probably 8 years ago, we could have probably repaired and torn down a triple-decker porch for around $15,000. Right now, that cost is around $30,000, right? How does a person that's collecting below market rent with family members come up with that kind of money to maintain the homes? So what's happening is that the first good offer that they get on that house, they're more than likely gonna take it, or they're gonna stay in a house that it will eventually become uninhabitable. So, our charge at D&D is, at least for my department, is to try to see these problems not as a larger housing issue, but trying to sustain a family and give them an opportunity to make some wise decisions, because it's happening all over. And I'm not sure how we're going to stop this thing. I'm not sure what else to say. You can ask me 1,000 questions and I will shoot back and give you some answers, because I see it on an individual family basis. And I'm just impressed that you guys are looking at this thing wider. But what I see it are the individual families that I have to try to sustain, and keep my focus on that family until I get the next family to work with. How do they come to us? They usually come to us through the neighborhood association. There's some marketing going on, and that neighborhood association will say, well, okay, you need to do these repairs before you have some code violations, or you need to do these repairs before the envelope gets so bad that the interior of the house starts to fall down. That neighborhood association then sends off an application to D&D. Somebody reviews it there, not me, and does a financial assessment of whether or not we should get involved in this with this house. I then come out, and often when I get out there, the problem is huger than $30,000, right? So I have to work with that family to figure out, how do I do some health and safety repairs to keep them going until they figure out some way of making a sound decision. And so if I come in and you want a new kitchen, but your porch is falling down, you're not going to get that kitchen. Even though that kitchen may not be up to standard, the fact that the porch is going to create a code violation forces me to then say, ma'am, I know that this kitchen is not the best kitchen and it's not functioning well, but I need to attack this code violation. So there's a lot of talking back and forth with the family of how do we utilize this $30,000? Because today $30,000 does very little in renovation, right? What else can I tell you about this? Usually, again, there's family members that are involved, and one of the reasons why maintenance hasn't caught, the cost of maintenance has outpaced, and I think Sam alluded to this, the cost of maintenance has outpaced the rental income that they're getting. And often if it's family members, for years, those family members have paid below market rent. So by the time they get to us, the house is in bad shape, and they certainly don't have the financing to get it into better shape. They probably have all kinds of code violations, and I only have $30,000 to try to do the best that I can to keep them in that property until they decide how they're going to move forward, right? Because if it's in really bad shape, like the homes that I see, and I get to see just the bad ones. I mean, some of the pictures that you guys show are beautiful. I wish 20% of the homes that I go into look like that, and they don't. So, I'm impressed with Sally and Sam about where they want to take this thing. Unfortunately, where I sit, it's not a rosy picture at all. And it's not even about affordable housing for renters. It's about families and trying to keep someone in their homes. And it's a tough thing. I don't know what else to say. I don't do these kind of meetings often, but I have a lot of information if anyone wants to ask, and I'll tell you about my experiences. But that's where we are in the city of Boston right now. And that includes East Boston, Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester. And these families are finding that they have to make decisions about selling before they become homeless in a home that is uninhabitable. And they're beautiful homes. They were beautiful homes at one time, but they've not been able to keep up with the maintenance. And a lot of these families were also working families, right? So you got to understand, these were families that were factory workers, immigrant families. Their income haven't gone up while the cost of repairs and the cost of everything else has gone up, and they just have not been able to maintain. So that's where we are, and that's what I do. And I think that we do a great job with the individual homeowners. But on a wider scale, I'm not sure how we're going to stop this train, because it is really moving. It's moving fast. And that would be it for me.
Thank you, Desmond. And thank you for also painting this, right, rather like realistic image as to what a lot of folks' realities really are. And I think that Sally, Sam, Desmond, your sort of stories have really dovetailed beautifully together, because, right, you can start to identify how can a local CDC, right, jump in so that we are talking about how we can preserve these homes, or how is it that we can be better advocates for this, what is commonly known as the missing middle, right, so that we are providing different ways to create naturally occurring affordable housing opportunities for folks as well. And with that, I think that I'll open the floor for any questions and thoughts, reflections that any of you might have in this space as well. And I always like to say that to the guest speakers, if there are questions that you would like to ask each other, this is also a space to do that, because you're also familiarizing yourself with the work that each of you does. And this is definitely the space to have those conversations. And so, yeah.
Well, I do have a question for Sam. So is there anyone in Somerville that fulfills almost the similar role that I have in Boston?
Yeah, so there is like a homeowner rehab type program in Somerville, and my coworker works pretty closely with that department in the city, and oftentimes we utilize that because one of the requirements is that you know, the rents be a certain level, you know, usually 80% AMI. So we often will have that. You know, I think a lot of what you said really resonated with me in thinking about the Somerville market. And, you know, I think it's not unlikely that we either have before I was there or could, you know, come into the opportunity to buy property from someone who could no longer afford to maintain it. And that's really sad. And I'd rather us, you know, acquire it than someone else. But frankly, I'd rather that person be able to stay in their home and be able to fix it themselves. So, and I say that because often a number of the properties we have acquired, including some of the ones I showed on my slide, really nice on the outside, but some of them, you know, need a lot of work inside. And we know that going in, and we know that, you know, we can take advantage of that homeowner rehab program at the city of Somerville to do some upgrades. But, you know, oftentimes we'll get that. So I think the one in, it was either the middle or the right on the slide that I showed, you know, had a number of vacant units in it because they had just completely fallen by the wayside. And so we had to do a lot of renovations to get those up and running and up at least. And yeah, we take advantage of that city program to often to do de-letting work, to provide some fire safety. We're doing some fire safety and de-letting work at one of our properties now. We've done some other renovations. Some of the buildings that we've acquired have had, you know, illegal unit conversions in them. So we had you know, like I don't even know, like a 4-bedroom, you know, apartment that wasn't code compliant. Had, you know, you had to walk through one bedroom to get to the other and things like that. And so a lot of the work we're doing on there is to getting that code compliant, getting it to the right size and right, you know, standards that it needs to be at. So, you know, there are a lot of, you know, intricacies and idiosyncrasies basically with these properties that we're acquiring. So we do take advantage of that city role, but again, I only really see it once we've acquired it. I'm less familiar with someone who would do that in the city of Somerville. And I know that program is available to homeowners, but I haven't seen it up close in person, how it works with individual landlords.
Yeah, and that is, this is Sally. I just feel like Desmond, what you're talking about is the core problem, that these are buildings that are 100 or more years old. Many of them are a lot older than 100 years old. And the maintenance is just so profound. The need is just so, I mean, things go downhill so quickly. I mean, I wonder, and working at small scale, at the scale of an individual building, I totally understand why the traditional approach, the other portfolio, for instance, that Sam's dealing with, is far more efficient. It just, you don't have to make an individual solution for every single property. And that's, I'm really disheartened. I mean, I know what Desmond's talking about, that, I mean, frankly, I see that on the CPA side in Boston, the deep need that comes out of the historic preservation applications that we receive, where buildings are important buildings and they just have such profound maintenance requirements, and it's expensive maintenance. It's not easy to do. So there's nothing generic about it, really. And that's the case in a single family house as well. So, yeah, it's tough. Desmond, one of the things I've wondered, when I worked for many years in Cambridge, one of the kind of core policy approaches was allowing infill construction on existing, not clearing the site, but doing a lot of low and moderate income rehab with existing buildings, but supplementing that with new construction. How have the two of you seen that happening, or do you see that as a possibility in Boston? I mean, I think it is a possibility in places where there is a backyard, but that's true of most of Roxbury and Dorchester. And I wonder if that's something that's been considered more by people who know a lot more about this than I do.
So yes, to your question, but there's some restriction and limitations around that, right? So in Boston right now, and it's expensive, and so we haven't had a lot of takers on this. So in Boston right now, if you have a triple decker and you have some of the triple deckers still have attic space, right? If you can take that attic space and make it into a fourth unit, we're helping with some funding behind that. The problem comes in with ISD about safety, right? So now you have to, once you get into 4 units, add that fourth unit, now you're incurring the cost of a sprinkling system, because they're telling you you need to have that. And not just for that unit now, the sprinkling system has to be retrofitted to the entire house. There goes your cost. If you do it in the basement, you've got the same issues. Part of the restrictions is that new added unit has to be part of the original footprint, right? So you can't use the backyard to build out, even though you have a large backyard, you can't put another unit in there, for your cousins that's coming up from Georgia or something, right? That's not going to happen. They won't allow you to do that. So there's some, there's some limitations around that. Yeah, that's where we stand right now. We're trying, but it's costly.
Yeah. And what Desmond is talking about is our additional dwelling unit program, where folks, can take a look at their home environments and try to see if you can transform an attic space, a basement, a section of a first floor into an additional unit. And that's true, right? That once we hit that 3+ right, that there is that requirement for sprinkling. And this is really an area of exploration and trying to see, are there carriage houses that also exist? Are there sheds? And how can we start to examine this housing need through this perspective as well.
Yeah, I did work for 20 years with the Mid-Cambridge Neighborhood Conservation District Commission, and which was basically established to manage the process of infill in that neighborhood, which was occurring largely in standalone units in the backyards of existing 2-3 family houses, single and 2 and 3 family houses. So that was allowable. Well, anyway, it's still, they're non-conforming units, but it was quite typical for that to occur, and for buildings to be subdivided internally to make additional units and basement spaces and stuff like that. Anyway, it seems like that's a real lost opportunity for families to begin to get a revenue stream out of a property without having to leave it.
I had an observation, if I could toss one in. Not so much a question, but something I've observed in the past kind of 6-8 months is, and kind of see going into at least the future 2 or 3 years, is the turbocharging really of the condoization of triple deckers and renovation for folks with higher incomes, especially as the cost of credit is just plummeted right now. It's completely exacerbating. It's making it cheaper for folks who have the means to do this work. So I think this conversation is incredibly timely related to that. If there's any mechanism for translating that low cost of capital to preserving affordability, now is definitely, I think, a moment of opportunity.
Sally, you're muted. So yeah.
It starts to feel like there isn't going to be a single one that hasn't been condoed, and that, you know, they're just going to stop being. I mean, in a way, that's still doing the things that it started off to do, which is to provide housing for 3 households, but it's just not affordable, and it just seems. It's just really depressing to think that there's no possible way to do that, and whether there are changes in the zoning code or tighter communication on or whatever, better coordination among different regulators to try to reach a laudable goal for the whole community and to save families.
I think it also really resonates, Desmond, with what you were saying about workforce housing with families who are able to afford to maintain it. Is, you know, the part of that is the incomes and what we can do to support that. And so I'm really struck by efforts to do workforce development, especially around the work that needs to be done to renovate and improve the housing stock. So I think there's a huge need. I work in the design and construction industry, right? And we have a huge worker shortage that drives up our costs. So we definitely see a need for that. And these are jobs with oftentimes really decent incomes that could start to move the needle. So I think it's almost like we have to solve six equations simultaneously, and then we can get there.
Yeah, I was just dovetailing off of what you said. I think one of the unique things about the triple decker was that, for the most part, and I'm going back to my memories in Dorchester, right? For the most part, families occupied all 3 units, right? And they're usually immigrant families, right? And so one person comes over to the United States, and somehow they buy a triple decker in one of the communities, or they come up from the South, or wherever they're coming from. And then each new family member that showed up in that city would have a place to live, right? Sometimes temporary, sometimes long-term. Once that original owner usually sells that property, the next person that comes in is usually the buyer doesn't come in with their family. And so that rent that you used to get from your cousin, which was enough cover the mortgage or, to help out, is no longer any good for this new investor, right? Because he's going to live there, he's going to be owner occupied, but he's going after the market rent. And then when that person leaves, the next person that buys it, it's a developer who doesn't even live there anymore, right? And so he's going to renovate it and he's going to condorize it. And we've seen it happening all over. And like Sally, I'm a little bit sad because I don't know how you stop this thing. And I've watched whole communities that I grew up in, that the homes were filled with kids and we played baseball on the team. We had enough kids on the team on the street to have a street baseball team, a street hockey team, right? And now I go down that same street and there are no children out there playing anymore. That's because the homes have been condorized, and if somebody wants to raise a big family, for whatever reason, they're no longer in the city. They can't afford those triple deckers. I don't know. I like you said, we're trying to solve so many problems at once, and the effort is there. I'm just not sure how we become successful.
Yeah.
I was, Sam, I was thinking about your problem in the buildings that you have. I mean, it's almost like, it would be really beneficial to be training up people who could work in those buildings, because if they can work in your buildings, they can work in people's buildings that are, people are wealthier. It's decent living.
Yeah. And so one of our, besides affordable housing, we have a number of other programs that we do at SEC, and one of them is what we call our First Source Jobs Training Program. It's a workforce development program, and we've been able to, connect some of our residents with job opportunities, and that's something we're trying to explore now. Is as the portfolio expands, we're continuing to add buildings and units and tenants. There are more and more maintenance needs, and some of them, have a smaller entry point, painting or something that's doesn't require as much experience. So it's something that we're trying to explore in terms of building our residents' sort of workforce opportunities. But a lot of what everyone just said really resonated with me, and I sometimes often feel like the problem of preserving the affordability of triple deckers or any sort of housing stock is not its own problem, but is a symptom of a larger problem of income inequality. Plain and simple, on one hand we have, as you mentioned, folks whose income hasn't risen at the same level as the maintenance needs have, and because those incomes have been stagnant, that's a huge problem. And on the other end, we have folks whose incomes have raised so quickly and so tremendously and enormously that they are the ones who can afford to fetch those really high prices for condos or for triple deckers, and they're the ones who can come in and buy them, and the prices go up because only so many are sold at a time, and the market knows that someone out there is willing to do that and someone out there is willing to pay for it. And because that's a possibility, no one wants to get less than that or pay less than that. And so every time a property is purchased and turns over, it becomes more expensive. It is refinanced at the current market rate, which is always going up. It's it's seen as an investment. It's seen as an investment. It's seen as a sort of vehicle for wealth building, and it just will only continue to go up. It'll be unaffordable for decades, unless maybe someday, 30 years from now, if they don't raise rents much beyond what they are now, and the market catches up to it or something, and it'll be relatively affordable. But by and large, every time it turns over, it gets more expensive. And so I think that's to all the work that we're talking about right now is really important, to be able to preserve the existing tenancies that are there, and then to be able to come in and maybe not preserve the existing tenancy, but buy it and then keep it affordable in perpetuity moving forward, so that it has fewer turnovers and less of a chance to skyrocket in terms of price.
I'm also noticing a question in the chat that from Alex. Are there other cities in the US or maybe Europe with good examples of successful affordable housing, to any of the speakers? Or to anybody in this space, actually. I feel like, right, we're always interested in hearing more about potential case studies, things that we could be learning with and from as well. And so if anybody wants to take a stab at this question, feel free to do so.
I mean, from my perspective, everyone's sort of dealing with cities like Boston are sort of dealing with the same problems everywhere. When I was in the Bay Area, we used to look to Boston as a model of someone who's doing it better. We used to learn. I went to undergrad in the Bay Area. We learned about DSNI and Dudley Neighbors Inc. And that was sort of seen as something. Oh, wouldn't that be great if we could do that here? And I know the Boston area does have I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but I do remember learning that the Boston area has a higher percentage of deed-restricted affordable housing than many other major cities in the country. Yeah, and I think the cities that, I don't know, that probably aren't struggling with the same crises that maybe do affordability better, just are smaller, maybe dealing with other crises more around the deterioration, loss of population and jobs, sort of a twin crises with people moving to large cities and fleeing, smaller towns that were maybe once industrialized. Though perhaps COVID is changing that with remote work, so we'll see. But yeah, I mean, I don't think, from my perspective, I've learned about here and there, this organization is doing that or that city's doing this, but there's no real clear-cut solution or catch-all, because if there were, we'd know about it and be doing it too, I think.
I think it's my experience in Cambridge and from living in Somerville, and I sort of, there was an interesting thing that Cambridge would do something and then Somerville would say, oh, look what Cambridge is doing, and then Somerville would do it better, and I was like, they're watching and they're beating you at it. But I think that one of the problems with preserving existing housing, either for affordability or even just simply for keeping it, is that it's so fine-grained. And I think that if you're in a smaller city, I think Boston, the scale is so large. Whereas in Somerville, you can, it's still a dense and densely populated and large city by most measures, or Cambridge for the same. But I think that it's possible to operate. It may be possible to line up more entities along a single path for a longer period of time to get something accomplished. I just feel like there are just so many moving parts in a city this scale of Boston, that unless you radically change the underlying assumptions, it's hard to see. And then, of course, every good intention has some bad intention that usually follows along of it. But it feels to me that the scale is one of the issues that really works against existing buildings and makes it much more feasible and efficient to build affordability in new construction. Although if new construction is not good quality, in 20 years, they're going to have the same problems. I don't know.
I think part of the challenge too is just, how do we define affordability, right? Because we're building the homes that we're saying that are affordable, and the families that go in there are still struggling to meet those rents, right? So yeah, I'm still trying, and we use income and we use median income and all of that. I'm not sure how that's working out for the general population. I think it's well intended, and certainly, one size isn't going to fit all, but there's some people that are getting squeezed. So I just throw that out.
Yeah, I agree. And I mentioned we have units at 100% AMI. And for those of you who don't know, AMI is the area median income. It's the sort of metric that's used to determine affordability in the region. The region for Boston is, Boston, Cambridge, Quincy. It goes even up to parts of New Hampshire. It covers a really wide area. And I don't remember the last time I checked, and the area median income for a family of four is about $100,000. But we still require subsidy in order to get our units to be as affordable as 100% AMI and 110% AMI. We have a condo property we're closing out now and we have 2 units at 110% AMI, and we required subsidy to get there because construction is so expensive, land is so expensive, everything, continues to rise. So, we're literally having to subsidize people who make above average incomes, or above median incomes at least. And I mean, yeah, the sales prices are, restricted at a certain level, but for a family of 4 who's making $100,000, it's hard to save up that down payment. It's hard to get in a position where you can, be in a position to buy.
There are 2 really big universal things I think about a lot. One is the subsidized 30-year mortgage, which really drove down the cost of home ownership on a monthly basis, but drove up the availability of capital for very expensive homes, which has really skewed the market and made, in places like Boston, where there's already an incredibly high demand for housing, period, it leads to inflated costs. And then the other is the mortgage interest tax deduction, which mostly goes to high income families. It costs, I just looked up, it costs $70 billion a year, which is more than the entire federal housing subsidy budget. So we're really, we're doing 2 things backwards that are subsidizing expensive homes for the wealthiest folks that we're clawing against in this kind of, in the big picture.
Yeah, the home mortgage interest deduction is the biggest subsidy for subsidizing housing in the country. And I've also, read arguments that I'm sort of sympathetic with that. While it sort of, it's in a sense subsidizes your home, eventually it becomes baked into the calculus of the purchase price, right? That someone who's going to buy your house can pay a little bit more for it because they're going to get that interest deduction, and the price keeps going up. Sorry, I think I cut you off, Sally.
No, that's okay. I would really recommend, I hadn't checked in on what Jake Wegman was doing, but I mean, he seems like a very rational guy to me when I've met him and talked to him. And this 2019 article on the missing middle, I thought was quite compelling. It's really saying, why is there any single family zoning? And it's inertia. It's just the way it's been set up, and everything else now hangs off of that. Or a lot of things hang off of that, like the 30-year mortgage and mortgage deduction. And if you start to shift some of those assumptions, then some other things may become possible. But it is pretty radical to think about, not having, allowing 3,000 foot units on a 3,000 square foot lot, or 5,000 square foot lot. I mean, my lot in Somerville was 5,000 square feet, which was pretty small, I thought, compared to my lot in Lexington that I lived in for a little while. And I could have built 5 houses on that lot in Lexington, but that's not what they're about. Or one giant house, which we did not do. I'm not going to do that. But it's a really, it's an excellent article, and gets at a lot of the inequalities and assumptions that have put us where we are now, with huge hurdles in achieving these goals that we would like to see.
A social problem, right? So this is how we all end up not knowing each other, right? Because people get segregated by finances and pulled apart, right? I was talking to Wendy earlier about growing up in Dorchester and the diversity that was in the community, right? And then over time, that really went away. And it's slightly coming back, but it's coming back at a higher income, right? So it's economics drives social.
People need to live together. People need to be in the same place.
Safely, right? Being considerate as to how things have also transformed just this year. But yes, Alex, sort of like noticing the chat and the different examples, Vivian, you're mentioning as to how housing is relatively affordable in other parts of the country as well. And right where we notice that there's a lot of tension is also where there's a huge income gap in cities like the one that a few of us are living in now. And I do want to be mindful of everybody's time tonight, but I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you that were able to join us tonight, to all of our guest speakers for also really engaging in conversation, yes, with our attendants, but also with each other, which is always really wonderful to see, especially with a topic that really weighs heavily on all of our hearts, right? How do we move towards making housing more affordable for families, for working class folks, for folks of color, and trying to also look at the ways and learn from the history of the triple decker, learn from the present of the triple decker, and trying to still actively think through how we can create future deckers or how we can transform existing triple deckers to become, right, buildings that can still exist in many of our futures. And so thank you all again. And in terms of next steps, we have one more final future Decker conversation, which is going to happen in January. Please be on the lookout for more information about this. It'll be our postponed event on anti-racist design. And so taking a look at the triple decker history through an anti-racist lens and really trying to engage in conversation, but also in activities with one another, right? I think that maybe many of us have engaged in so many conversations around race this year. Maybe some of us haven't, right? But really providing an opportunity for us to come to a closing around this series, around this exhibition, and to think about how we can do better moving forward, and maybe set some goals for the upcoming year. And so thank you again for being a part of tonight's conversation, and we will make sure to stay engaged.